today we are celebrating the launch of Erica Moiah James's lovely book, After Caliban, Caribbean Art in a Global Imaginary. I've been lucky enough to read parts of it, and I'm excited to finish it. It features so many incredible artists, from Belkis Ayon to Edouard Duval-Carrier, and many more. And it's an amazing contribution to the history of art, the history of Caribbean art, and we're so excited to have you here with us. So I will just start by introducing Dr. Erica Moiah James along with her panelists, and then we will start the conversation from there and open it up for questions for the audience at the end. So many of you may know Dr. Erica Moiah James as an art historian, a curator, and associate professor at the University of Miami. Before arriving in Miami, she was the founding director and chief curator at the National Gallery of the Bahamas and an assistant professor of art history and African American studies at Yale University. Her research centers on indigenous, modern, and contemporary art of the Caribbean, Americas, and the African diaspora. James has been awarded several grants and fellowships in support of her work, including the Warhol Foundation Creative Time Art Writing Prize and grants from the Terra and Mellon Foundations for the Geoffrey Holder Project. Most recently, she curated the exhibitions of Didier William, Nari Ward, and LaVaughn Belle. She is a senior research associate at VIAD, University of Johannesburg, and a former Clark-Oakley Fellow. Her current book that we're celebrating today is After Caliban, Caribbean Art in the Global Imaginary, published with Duke University Press this year. So Erica is also in conversation with incredible scholars who will undoubtedly deepen the range of topics that we talk about today. Richard J. Powell is the John Spencer Bassett Distinguished Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. Dr. Powell teaches courses in American art and the arts of the African diaspora and writes on a range of topics. Some of his publications include Homecoming, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson, 1991, Black Art, A Cultural History, 1997, 2002, and 2021, Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture, 2008, and Going There, Black Visual Satire, 2020. His forthcoming book, Color Struck, Painting, Pigment, Affect, comes out in 2026 and traces the visual and conceptual pathways of particular colors as strategically employed by selected modern and contemporary painters. So we're excited for that to come out as well. Our next panelist, Patricia J. Saunders, is professor of English and Hemispheric Caribbean Studies at the University of Miami, where she is a founding editor of Anthurium, a Caribbean studies journal. She is the author of Alienation and Repatriation, Translating Identity in Anglophone Caribbean Literature, published in 2007, and co-editor of Music, Memory, Resistance, Calypso, and the Caribbean Literary Imagination, also published in 2007. Her second monograph, Buyers Beware, Epistemologies of Consumption in Caribbean Popular Culture, was published with Rutgers University Press in 2022 and examines a range of contemporary Caribbean popular cultural modes of expression, including Jamaican dancehall music, practices of body modification, as well as works by Caribbean contemporary visual artists Ebony G. Patterson, Christopher Cozier, and Leasho Johnson. So we're grateful to have the three of you here with us today, and I'm excited for this panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I want to start today by offering a ton of thanks. and first, I want to thank really my sincere gratitude to Kelly Jones, who, of course, a lot of the people I'm going to thank are not here, but they were so important in bringing this together that I have to say their names. And Kelly Jones and Stephen Nelson and Ken Wissaker and the entire Duke University Press team really supported the publication of this text from the beginning to the end, and I am incredibly grateful. I also want to thank Gene Moreno here at the ICA. Gene has been so amazing to me since I set foot in Miami, and he's really supported my thinking process for this book through years of assigning me and giving me various invitations to write on the work of artists that I loved. And every time I heard from him, it was like, you want me to write on And I'm like, wow, this is so amazing. So I'm really grateful for him because in a lot of ways, we're here at the ICA partly because he allowed me to think through portions of this book here at this institution. And I want to also thank Donna Hoparniche. I hope I didn't butcher your name, for really organizing this and being open to this. And so many other people, the Oakley Center at Williams College, the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Miami, particularly Dean Cohen and Dean Bacchus, who really, if you look at the book, it's copiously illustrated. And if you've ever published something, you know that costs a lot of money. And I'm really grateful for them for really, for supporting the image rights and just allowing me to have all of that. I want to thank my chair, who's here. And Nathan, I didn't put this in just because I saw you walk in the door, trust me. But I was going to say this anyway. I really want to thank my chair, my department chair, Nathan Timpano, and my colleagues at UM. I think Nathan gives me a lot of room to do my thing. And I'm sure he supports me in ways that I can see, but many ways that I do not see. And I just want you to know that I'm really grateful for that. And I want to thank the Center for Global Black Studies, Professor Donna Francis, who isn't here, but they bought the book for all UM students that are here. So if you are from the University of Miami and would like a copy of the book, I have one for you. And the artists, Janine Anthony, Chris Cozier, Edward de Valcarre, who is here. Thanks, Edward. We're doing so many things together. I think we need to just move in. Mark Latamy, Blue Curry, and all of the artists that supported the publication. And my sister isn't here, Keisha, but I want to really thank my family as well. My sister Keisha and my sister Evadne, who can't be here. Keisha's coming. She says she's going to be here. Late. But my sisters really are a huge support for me, and they allow me to do the work that I do and also care for our mother and to make sure that our mother is okay. And so I can be here today without worry because I know my mom is safe and that Keisha has made sure that that happened. And thanks to Rick and Pat Saunders also for agreeing to be in conversation with me. I thought it was really funny that when Donna suggested you, Rick, because you were here at the beginning and we will not talk about, well, maybe we will talk about that. You were here at the beginning as I was formulating these ideas and Pat was there at the end to really pull me over the finish line. So I'm really happy to be in conversation with you both. And I know, and I just want to name someone who isn't here as well, but who has been an incredible part of my life. And I dedicate the book to him. And it's my grandfather, Eddington Burroughs. When I was a really tiny child, I found my grandfather fearsome. He was like 6'4", he was really tall, and he seemed incredibly gruff. But family circumstances allowed me to go live with him at the age of 7. After the death of my grandmother. And I don't think I would be standing here today without my grandfather. My grandfather, when my parents tried to temper my dreams, thinking that they were protecting me from disappointment, it was my grandfather who always stood in to defend me and to help me realize those dreams. I mean, from helping me pay for college to just everything. And I love him dearly. So I dedicate this book to him because, as I say in the acknowledgments, he remains the best person I have ever known. So I want to talk a little briefly and introduce you or share with you my thinking process. Now, some of the ideas for this book took shape during my dissertation under Rick Powell's advice. But even in writing it, even as I was writing my dissertation, really wanting to satisfy those requirements, I knew that something about it didn't sit right, about the dissertation. It wasn't until an event at the Americas Center in 2012, after my time spent in the Caribbean at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, that I actually went back to the book. I finished my PhD in 2009, and I didn't look at my dissertation again, right? But after 2012, I decided I should probably look at this again. And I started with a mind to finish it and to think it through. But it has taken me a long time, as you can tell. So my work, in my work, I'm really taken with the generation of Caribbean thinkers and writers that arose in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Writers that lived in colonialism and wanted to think themselves out of it. So those who tackled the process of decolonialism and the possibilities of the post, right? So I am a CLR James fan, a Césaire fan, a Fanon, a Brathwaite, Hogg, Lasant, Benitez Rojo, etc. But one day I was reading an interview that David Scott was conducting with that generation. He did this incredible series of interviews with members of that generation who was still alive. And he was speaking with Sylvia Wynter, who you see on the screen here. Wynter is a Jamaican writer born in Cuba, as most of you know, and she's had an extraordinary life. The McKittrick book had come out on stream, and she was suddenly a star. But this interview that David did was very personal, and I really gravitated towards what she was saying. In the interview, she recounted a story as a young writer, as an artist and a young writer, where she was struggling to really figure out what to write in this moment when Jamaica was about to enter independence. We were in federation that was falling apart, and Jamaica was about to become independent. And for a lot of people, independence meant entering this sort of post-colonial movement. And she was, she wanted to know what to write, what was necessary in this moment. And so Elsa Gavia, this amazing person that you see on the left there, posed a question to her. She said, how do you deal? I want you to think about this. How do you deal with the stereotyped view of yourself that you yourself have been socialized to accept? In other words, how does one push back against the weight of a colonial definition of oneself, to define, to affirm, and continually recreate oneself, to claim and enact freedom through creation as a decolonial act? What do you write and create in that space, in that consciousness? Years later, because of course these things don't come right away, I was reading Jose Lalzama Lima's defense of the 19th century Cuban poet Julian Casal, who was increasingly being critiqued as inauthentic in a post-revolutionary Cuba. And Lalzama Lima really spoke beautifully about how Casal's act of creation itself, in the context of a Caribbean, was a critique of the system that had sought to subdue it and had sought to subdue people like him. He states, if we speak of criticism as creation, not production, then poetry adheres to the theory of knowledge. And he said that in the context of the Caribbean, we're not Europe. And we must look for another approach, finding creation, finding pain in everything. One culture assimilated or unassimilated by another is not a comfort. Indeed, no one has given it away as a gift. Instead, it is a painful act, one that is both creative and creative. Now, all of these answers to Wynter's question by Govia, to what Lalzama Lima was answering in terms of critiques of Julian Casal, talks about critiquing through creation, critique through creating art. And I started to notice that this generation was talking to each other, right? Wynter responded to Govia's charge, and she wrote The Hills of Hebron. She responded by making art. And it's a book that's based wholly in a Black Jamaican town, in a Black Jamaican experience against the backdrop of the religious group of Bedouinism. There isn't a colonial person in sight in that book. And I started to think about books like The Black Jacobins and The Dragon Can't Dance, all in this notion as responding to Govia's question. And not only responding to it, by answering it, by creating art. And I realized, at least for me, that these are Caribbean modern texts, right? That Caribbean modernism itself, as we think about it, is a decolonial enterprise. It is phenomenological and outside of time. It rises as necessary. And I also realized that this generation, as I said, was speaking to each other, speaking about art in a way that was revolutionary and in a way that really aligned with Aimé Césaire. I'm not going to read all of this, but you really should. It's an essay that Césaire wrote called "The Man of Culture and Responsibilities." It's from 1959, and he wrote it. It was published in Présence Africaine, and it's a essay that he comes back to. He comes back to, and he gives another version of it in Havana, at a conference in Havana in the 1960s as well. And in this text, he goes on to give a mandate for future generations. And it's not like artists weren't answering the call. You see this post 1959. You see it in what artists were producing in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. But I began to see that by the 1990s, it was a flood, and it was happening on a global scale. And I think I use a tempest a lot in this text as a grounding text. And in a tempest, I think it models what is possible. And I approach the art in this book with that model and with that text in mind, right? And here, Aimé is giving this sort of mandate to create, that decolonization will happen there's an aesthetic war arena that we must create, and yeah, it's actually quite powerful. So I think of art as theoretical forms. And so my interest is always in trying to assess or focus on the work of this work. What are these writers doing for me? What are the artists doing for me? What is the work of that work? What are they and their creations doing? What is the critique? And it is a question that I use to organize each chapter. This ethos really undergirds my work as an art historian. I see, like Aimé Césaire, like Sylvia Wynter, like Elsa Gavia, I see critique in creation, right? And I agree with Juan Francisco Elso, who said that in the Caribbean and in the Americas, we have everything we need to create epic art. And I want to just say that this is a text that was also in my head as I wrote this book. It's an anthology I discovered when Rick sent me to create my reading list as a PhD student. And it's an anthology that was edited by John Hearn, Jamaican writer John Hearn, that for me always provided a model for Caribbean studies. And it includes writers from the English, French, Dutch, and and Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And it also includes the continental Caribbean, Mexico and Colombia as well. And for me, as a young person just trying to figure out this field, I always wanted to write in a way that embraced the entire Caribbean. I didn't just want to write about artists from the English-speaking Caribbean, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, et cetera. Jackie Bishop is here, and one of the reasons for this happened is because of market women. And in traveling to Curacao, I remember going to Curacao, I was trying to meet with the filmmaker and artist Felix DeRoy in Curacao, and I went to Curacao, and I came upon all of these Caribbean women from everywhere else in Curacao buying goods, right? And the same thing happened when I went to Cuba. And they were from the English-speaking Caribbean everywhere, but we call them higglers. But these higglers knew just enough Spanish and not just enough French and just enough of what they needed to do to get by. And I'm like, these are the kinds of spaces I want to inhabit in my work. These spaces that we kind of ignore because we've been taught to see, as Elsa Gavia says, we need to push back on ourselves from a colonial perspective, and not the ways in which we have negotiated this world and this life in very interesting ways. So I tested this approach, once again, returning to Gavia's challenge and using it as a starting point for the book to re-engage the work. And while I was writing After Caliban, Ken Wissaker actually suggested that I do this, and I did. I don't think he realized the extent to which I took his words. I started writing around the book, and I started testing out my ideas on other artists. And I wrote, and Jean had a big hand in a lot of this. I wrote on Juan Francisco Elso for El Museo. I wrote on Hervé Telemaque for the ICA. I wrote on Simone Lee and Ricardo Bray and Thomas Esson and a lot of different artists, thinking about their work from the perspective of Elsa Gavia, that they were answering that question without even knowing it, that they were creating as critique, right? They were creating, and their act of creation could be read as a decolonial process, right? And writing about this and these essays and these chapters as I was rethinking the book really helped to sharpen and expand my argument. And when I started to work on the Geoffrey Holder Project, I know you're going to say, when does she have time to do anything? She's doing all this work, right? But I don't know. But it happens. It all kind of comes together somehow. I started working on the Geoffrey Holder Project, and when Leo shared this clip.
Most people of color who come to America and encounter it, especially in the 50s, didn't have an opportunity to tell their story to too many people necessarily, or too many people that were listening. And the thing that's extraordinary to me is that somehow you made that transition almost effortlessly.
I walk through doors.
Now, why? What do you attribute that to?
I walk through doors. If I'm not wanted in a place, there's something wrong with the place, not me.
So the question, it's a question that arises a lot in colonial conditions where you become aware of the epistemes that have been used to ensure that you see yourself as a deformed creature. And when you know you need to reject it. And it's a question that I've asked myself in relation to the academy, in relation to institutions, in relation to my discipline, in relation to my field, in relation to art writing, etc. So I begin the book with the question, what's wrong with this place? And the book itself is a part of that answer. So let's have a conversation.
Thank you for that lesson, for that sermon, for that song.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about a lot of things this afternoon, but I did write some things down to start us off.
Okay.
And my first prompt is global. That's your modifier for Caribbean. And I'm curious to hear why global is the modifier.
Oh, God. These hard questions already, right? It's so funny because I went back and forth with the press about whether it was the global or a global, right? And we settled, I'm like, it must be a global. And what I've always understood, like many art historians, I'm a fallen artist. I started out as an artist. And, oh, hi. I started out as an artist, and my view of the Caribbean was always one that was unbound. It was when I encountered Edward's work, not in Haiti, but in Paris, right? I encountered Belkis's work for the first time, I think, in New Jersey. And then New York, and I was really attuned to the ways in which our Caribbean artists were moving in the world, but also still engaged with the region. And that the way that we had structured art history as being very located in terms of geography, that the Caribbean put pressure on that sort of designation and those boundaries. And when I was at Duke, I remember Grant Farrad, one of my professors, assigning Beyond a Boundary by C.L.R. James. And C.L.R. James has this amazing chapter on what is art. And he talks about art around the game of cricket. And the way he talks about space and the players on the pitch and the audience and how art is catalyzed in that space. I realized that for me, he was describing how I saw Caribbean artists working in the world and the work, moving across these sort of tried and true boundaries that we had set up as art historians, and that we were, in a sense, complied. People wanted us to fit in those boxes. And immediately I realized that the thinking and the work itself was more capacious, that it was moving beyond that, and that I had to find a sort of concept to sort of gather it in and become a kind of Glissantian plateau for me to engage it.
Thank you.
Testing.
I want to begin first by saying thank you for this wonderfully wayward. I love waywardness. That's why we're such good friends. Um, but I finished the book last night and went back and started reading it again because it really moved me. It really moved me intellectually. I wish more of my graduate students were here because there is a capaciousness to the project. And what I'm calling waywardness is a way of not just resisting the box, but out of hand rejecting the box. As a literature person, I was tickled pink to see the way in which the literary canon has shaped the way you think about contemporary art. But I also know I kept reading and putting notes in the margin saying, this is Erica art historian, Erica curator, Erica artist, right? Because I feel like I see all of those critical perspectives in the work. Can you talk say a little bit more about how Brathwaite and Césaire and James, all of the people, and Lovelace that we think of as largely sort of literary figures, why do they feature so prominently? What is it that they offered you as a frame to think about contemporary art?
I was having a conversation with some graduate students who were interviewing me at UM the other day, and it really came to me when they asked a really literary question, right? I'm like, I can just tell you're a literature people, right? I said, but I don't think that way. I think of texts as objects, and I think of them as works of art. And I ask the same questions of a literary text that I ask of a work of art. What is the work of this work? What is this artist and what is this writer? What do they want from me? I mentioned that a little bit earlier. So I think about it as I teach Adrian Piper's work, and I always want my students to understand what she meant by catalysis and to catalyze. For me, that is fundamental to the art experience, whether you're getting it from a book or a text, or whether you're getting it from a work of art. What is the work, what is being catalyzed in the process or what is an artist asking of you through an object? What is that object? Where is that object leading you? And so I read text to be, amazed. And as you know, I get really excited when I read something that just blows my mind. And I just remember thinking when I read Dragon Can't Dance for the first time, my mind was blown. I was in college, taking a class at Morehouse. I was on exchange at Spelman. And I was taking Caribbean literature at Morehouse and just eating up everything. And I just realized that there was something here that we want to know the story, but there's something about this text it's doing a certain kind of work. And I think of literature in that way, and that's how I deconstruct, not line by line, but as a whole object, and thinking about what it's catalyzing for me in my mind. And so Dragon Can't Dance, The Black Jacobins, The Hills of Hebron, Brother Man by, all of these texts really gave me a kind of archive to work from. And so I think of that text the same way I would think of Janine's Noah,
One of the things that really got me fired up about After Caliban was the feeling of reading it and feeling as if I was in the audience. And there were these different acts that were moving from New York / Nassau, Havana, then Port-au-Prince, Miami. I mean, and so we have Aimé Césaire's A Tempest as the centerpiece. And he, in turn, is in conversation with William Shakespeare. So I guess my question or meditation that I'd love to hear a little bit from you about is melodrama, tragedy, and comedy seem to be undergirding all of these stories that you've shared with us.
That's a great question. I'm going to try and answer. And I think I'm going to go back to your question as well, because you mentioned Brathwaite. And for me, Brathwaite played an incredible role in the formation of my dissertation and in this book, also by what he modeled and what he said, right? And I think, and Brathwaite is someone who I got to work really closely with on like 3 transformative occasions, to watch him work, but to also have him sort of read, give me advice personally on what I was writing. And he could make that move you just described really easily, right? The theater, he talked about experiences, and suddenly they became literary, and then they became a poem, and memoir became poetry, became this, became that, became critical essay. And he sort of modeled the way in which you could think in different tones or different modalities about the same thing, and that there was something different being expressed, almost a different tone or different dialect in each mode that he was speaking in or working in. But I think part of that is intentional in this case as well. Honestly, I have a friend who is 81 years old, and he's from Chicago, and his name is Richard as well. And he's reading the book, and he said, "Erica, you know, this is a really angry book. You're really pissed." And I'm like, "Well, you should have read the first draft. You know, it was. I thought it was angry then, but I didn't think it was angry now. You know, I thought I had brought that in." But I say that to say, a part of this is also, I used to get a question all the time. "Oh, so you work on Caribbean art. What is Caribbean art? What is this?" Over and over and over again. And so I was a little bit upset. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book is to show that the Caribbean is almost a conceptual idea. It's a place, it has a history, but in the realm of the aesthetics, it becomes a work or something that people grapple with, and they do it in different ways, right? And they evoke different sensibilities in their work, from humor, seriousness, violence. You know, a fundamental part of Caribbean modernity is violence. It can be, the art doesn't have to all look alike. The art doesn't have to be all, you know, like the Impressionists working in a certain way, but they can be at the same time expressive of a certain ethos or make a certain demand on us. And for me, it's to, in a sense, work beyond boundaries, you know, that art history and the art market and certain structures that organize this world that we live in tends to demand of artists. So I wanted to do that.
So what I'm hearing from you is kind of, there's an intentionality to the drama, but it's also the reality of lives led. And we were joking earlier about, you know, the main text, but then when you get to these footnotes, you get the backstory. And you're saying, wow, you know, there's even more there that reveals itself. Just as, you know, in a performance that you get these elements that even turn action and intention and artistic will and volition into something that's highly personal and psychological. I mean, I think what makes this so powerful for me is giving art that kind of fullness that most art historians just don't do.
This is my mentor. I may get emotional. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Rick.
And I think I want to follow up on what Rick was saying, because, again, to me, this isn't just art history, right? That's what I kept thinking as I'm reading it, because it's the only way I can think about it is that this book gives art legs. Like it moved me emotionally, right? But it also moved me into these spaces, archival spaces, the spaces of studios, the spaces of, I learned more, and this is where I think you may think of yourself as a fallen artist, but I learned so much about composition in art from reading this book. And I said, an art historian couldn't write this kind of book, this kind of detail, the way you read Belkis Zion's work, about the textures, the tonalities, all of these things. Why was that? I mean, it's not why was that important, but I'm at a loss for words. Oh my God.
Well, I think of art as a falling artist. I think of art as a theoretical form. And I know that an artist is speaking through materials, through process. It helps that I was taught by a fallen artist who became an art historian, and other fallen artists. Like Duke was filled with them, back then, right? And so they really paid attention to, the material mattered, the process mattered. You don't look at a beard and collage without thinking about the components of collage and the sort of signifying capacities of collage itself, as a kind of approach and medium. And so I've always been attentive to that, first as an artist, but then as an art historian. And I think always thought it was something I could add to this field. And I should say that Caribbean art history is a young field. So this text was also about field formation. Like, what can I do to, in a way, shape a field or provide students who are interested in Caribbean art? What could I then model? If I claim that Césaire is modeling through the Tempest, what then can I model, or could I model as an art historian for people interested in doing Caribbean art history, and do it in a way where in the 90s you would read the work of, you would read these, even Belkis, who won the Maastricht Prize and all these incredible things, they would say 3 words or 3 lines about her work and just leave it at that. And for me, that would upset me. I'm like, why don't they see more? And so I think this text also was about a certain accountability, that I could write 60 pages on one of Edward's paintings because it had that much in it, and I could go on. That there was so many dimensions to this work that was not being engaged. And I wanted to model how that's possible. I also wanted people to read it. So I thought about pauses. I literally thought about clarity. I think working in a museum helped. Working at the National Art Gallery and being responsible for beginning a national conversation to an audience that did not know. When I remember the first day when we opened the gallery, the main person at the news agency came up and he said, "I want you to explain to me what is a curator." So we were starting from nothing, right? How do you cultivate that without speaking down to people? So there's a consciousness in me that I want to communicate. And I want to communicate not only with academics, but I want to communicate with everyone. And I also, so there are moments where this gets really academic-y, but then there are pauses, there are breaths. And I consciously thought about breaths and a more, because I believe publics could get it if you write in a certain way. And I also wanted to personalize it to the end, because I thought the work that we did in the Bahamas was important and notable, but also the ways in which it became a part of the Caribbean through that work. So I made it personal to the end, and I brought in the I. I shifted. Yeah. All of that, it was conscious, and just moving around that.
And if I can just follow up on that, there's a whole lot of your legwork in this book. Mm-hmm. From going to talk talking to Belkey's family, to Paris, to Edward's studio, to hear their interviews, segments of interviews, which kind of threw me because it wasn't what I was expecting in terms of form. Why was it important for you, for your reader, to see and hear and know
The voice.
the voice and the legs that went into, I'm saying all this, remembering you climbing up to those forts, and I'm in order to work on this next project.
New work.
but again, it's just, there's an enormous amount of, I can see the intellectual labor of this project, but there are all of these other labors of affect, labors of intellect, and just being willing to get up and go to these places and talk to people and talk to artists and question them very intentionally about their practice and their thinking about their work.
Yeah, it's funny because Caribbean art history is hard. It actually takes a lot of work, and I think a lot more than going into a single archive. You really have to go and see. You really have to go and do, and you have to talk, and you have to find archives. I mean, our whole project is all about working in personal Black archives and the difficulties of that. And so you have to go and see these archives, and you have to follow, and you can't sit and wait for anything to come to you. You have to go out there and I had to go find Felix Deroy. I didn't find him, and that's why he isn't in the book. But I had to go to Curacao to search for him, right? But I think I do what I think the work requires, and I've always been very, even as a graduate student, I would just research for 2 weeks for my final papers. I would just read and research. I wouldn't write a thing. And I would read a lot and around things and around ideas, et cetera. Then I would sit to write notes on everything I've read, and then I would start reading. So I've always been someone and I would chase an idea. Like if I had an idea, and this is Brathwaite, I think, I would chase that idea. I would go for it. I would go and read more, go see more, do more. And I also think just, I don't know, who trained me, how I was trained. I am attentive to certain things. I think Christine Stiles' work on performance, for instance, has been probably not in the way she thinks it's helped me, but just the ways I think about Caribbean movement, for instance, and how Caribbean people, as I'm doing right now, speak with our hands, right? And how that, and how that's textual and how that can be brought in. But each work of art demands something else. Right? Janine, I told Janine when I first interviewed her, I said, I needed to get a hold of your work for myself before I met you, because I don't want to like you. And she was like, what are you talking about? I'm lovely, But yeah, I didn't want to like my artist. I didn't want to like you, Edward, first. I wanted to just... and now we're good friends, but I just wanted to work on the work, and I wanted to sort of not have the personality of the artist impede what, So, and she was incredibly generous to me here in Miami, actually. We met for the first time in Miami. And has been. I would say that all of these artists, Mark Latomy, Chris, everyone in this book has been incredibly generous to me, and in terms of their time, and also allowing me to have my thoughts. Janine didn't always agree with me, and we decided we would just disagree. And then she's, and so yeah, though there are those moments, but they allowed me to be their audience, to actually, because they want this work to speak to an audience, right? And they gave me room to sort of think and dream and sort of formulate it. From my perspective. So you sort of see that.
So for me, one of the outlying chapters in this book, and also one of the most amazing chapters in this book, is the Belkis Sayon chapter. And I'd like to hear a little bit about, because you've talked about, spending time with Edouard and Janine and Chris. I don't think you had that opportunity with Belkis. And yet it ends up being an amazing statement or statements about the work, about how she's perceived in the art historical world, her existence on this planet, her post-existence on this planet. Just could you say a little bit about that?
Whew, without crying, eh? Belkis, how do I even begin? I first saw La Senna, and I think it just asked something of me, right? I didn't know who Belkis was. And then I started to do the research, right? And I learned, I don't know, you went to Havana, I think at the Havana Biennial, and you may have come back and said, oh my God, there's this show. Oh, and see, he doesn't even remember it, but it happened. And that it was amazing. And I was already finding out about her. But I started, once again, it's a place of dissatisfaction. You want to read, you want to find, you want to read about someone, and you look at a work of art and you realize everything that's before you, everything that people have said isn't enough, that you see so much more. And I have to pursue that. And this is really corny, but I mean, the first time, I also had a sort of spiritual connection with Belkis. It was kind of weird. I went to New York to her collectors, the Rosenbergs, who were representing her during her lifetime at their house right by the old Breuer building, by the Met. They lived right near there. And I entered their apartment and I saw La Senna. And I went straight to La Senna and I sat down and I was just looking at it. And she said, oh my goodness, Belkis sat right there, and why are you reminding me of her today? And why is her birthday? And then I found out her birthday was on the 23rd and mine's the 22nd. And I don't know, there were just all these weird moments. But it was from a place of dissatisfaction. The fact is that I knew this work had so much to say. And that as I read the literature by very prominent people that I love as art historians and curators, I realized there was it was being diminished in a way that I didn't see in her work. And then and it was funny, the Bayesian artist Rash Aishi and Rasa Kem had come to the Bahamas. I'd invited them. And I said, oh, I'm doing this writing on the Belkis. And they were like, we knew her. And they told me about her and how, and so I got these sort of stories from people who were in Havana working with her, Arisa, who could tell me a story. And so I didn't meet her, but I felt could see her through her work and the intentionality of the work. And almost as a responsibility, I think, as an art historian interested in this, that I had to go there where she wanted to go. And the first time I went to Cuba, are we allowed to say that these days? The first time I went to Cuba, because I wanted to see the color version of La Senna, I wanted to see more of her work. I just had a really incredible experience as a Black woman in Cuba. I was staying at this really great hotel, and I was trying to get back into that hotel, and they wouldn't let me. Because I was a Black woman. And I had to speak the best English I possibly could for them to let me through. There was a lot of prostitution going on, et cetera. They felt, I assumed that I was engaged in that. And so I started to not romanticize Havana and Cuba. That incident just took the romance out. And so I started to ask different questions. When I was like, so what else is she saying here? What are these choices? And I was just really fortunate with the Rosenbergs giving me a lot of the writings that she had written to them. I was very fortunate that they gave me all the writings they had written, and everything they had. They were really supportive of the project. And so I got to see how she thought, and I'm like, yeah, she wants us there's more to this, and I need to tell that story, not what we have seen or what we know or the three lines, and it's not just about Abakwa. It's not just about this. This is about a lot of things, and at the same time, I was an Aaliyah fan, a Guter, and I was thinking intergenerationally already with Césaire and this. So I'm like, let's push this and see what surfaces. And so many things started to surface once I started to think about her beyond how Abakwa, and for me, Vodun is the same way. These are conceptual ideas in the Caribbean that can be really, they have so much potential. You see it in Edward's work, and I could see it in Belkis's work, and I think I probably spent a lot more time also on that. I kept going back. It kept wanting more. And so there, yeah.
I feel like book chapters are like children. You're not supposed to have a favorite one, right? And yet I kept oscillating between the chapter on Belkis and the chapter on Edward's work. And I was just thinking, what's striking to me about the oeuvre of the artists is that they're remarkably different. I mean, different mediums, different perspectives, even though the argument is about the various ways in which they are engaged in that historical reimagining that you talk about earlier in the book. Did you ever feel any kind of contradiction in working across such a wide range of art? Because they're very different artists working in different mediums, I would say generationally. And as you said, I kept thinking, well, who else could she have included? Or lots and lots. So I think what I'm trying to get at is what made you settle on these artists? As opposed to, I can think of at least 7 other artists you could have done this work with.
Yeah, and I probably could have picked any. I can think of 20 or 30 easily, and I say that at some point in the text. And I initially started. These were the artists I initially wrote on it for my dissertation, and I thought about changing it. I started writing. I wanted to include Nari Ward. I'd written on Nari's work. I'd shown his work. I'd curated his work. I wanted to include, there are lots of artists that I could include. But once again, I was really interested in what Edward's work said beyond, not just the object, but what it said as a kind of ecosystem. I was interested in the ways Janine's work worked in New York City and within other discourses of feminism, social art history, etc. I was interested in the ways that he could make us think about Vodun as a conceptual idea, as a theoretical, a sort of space to think about the world, right? I was interested in the ways history, he was reinforming, taking a genre in art history, Western art history, and making it his own, and taking that and just blowing it, just doing his thing, right? I can't look at you, Edward, right now, but just really putting pressure on the assumptions of that genre. So in the way all of these artists take tropes of Western art history and blow them up, they take it in a new direction. And for most people working on contemporary art, that it's not just about the medium, it's about the idea, right? It's about the concept, it's about that. And I found that in each case, they were breaking down, they were doing decolonial work, right? In every case. Even when we don't see it at first, you see the work of their work was something that I think people needed to sort of hone in. So it wasn't and I think the multiplicity of mediums and process and approaches were extremely important because we have to understand the scope, that you can take everything you need everything is at your disposal to put forth the ideas that you want to through the work.
So, since we're talking about this chapter, I've just got to read the title. Historical Drag, Genre, Violence, and History in Edouard Duval-Carrier Mardi Gras at Fort Dimanche. I mean, to me, that's a movie. It's got everything you want. Drama, history, politics, spirituality, family wildness. I mean, and it all swirls around this one painting. And I just have to say that this chapter just kind of is such an exemplary work of not just art history, but you move us in and out of that painting into history. I mean, from several hundred years ago to contemporary history. So it's how did you figure? How were you able to use one painting and give us a world?
I have to say that was the hardest chapter to write. It was difficult and it was emotional. It was an emotional chapter. I think if any of you, if you've ever visited Haiti, spent time in Haiti, care about Haiti, you know that to write on the history, and if you know what Edouard is trying to encompass in his work, is not easy. It isn't easy. So I had to sit and spend a lot of time with that. But he gave it to me. That's the thing I want people to understand. It's not me doing this. It's me actually taking the time to look at the work and what the artist is giving me. Nothing I say or said about that painting isn't something that Edouard gave to me in the painting, right? And we don't spend a lot of time looking at work. I spend a lot of time looking at work. I spent a lot of time thinking about why you did something. I see Candy here. I think about why she, wants to work on portraiture and I think about those things a lot. And maybe I have time to do it. I don't know. But that painting, when I saw it, I just could see worlds in it. I could see, I went to the Prado and I sat in front of the Velázquez for like a day, just writing about what I saw to come back to look at your painting again. I knew I could understand all the symbolism. I'm fascinated with genre and family and particularly portraiture and family portraits. And you just don't see that genre a lot in Caribbean art. So Edouard was here working these genres, working these histories, but transforming it. And in that difference, in that distance between the historical reference and what he was doing, he was worlding a world. And I thought that once again, I wanted to write beyond the 3 lines. I wanted people to understand the depth of this work and what is possible, and to put pressure on writers and art historians when they come back to engage Caribbean artists, that they have to do some work, right? And spend some time with this work to see more than the quick soundbite or whatever. I want them to dig in because as I did more research, and when I asked the Bass to pull the painting for me, I spent a day with the painting. I noticed things that I couldn't see in the reproduction. The frame became more alive to me, became a part of the composition. There was just more. I just kept seeing more. It's in the work, and what I think I'm doing is just responding to what the artist is giving me and taking it seriously, right? And just whatever path they send me on, I'm like, I'm game. I'm gonna see how far this goes. Yeah.
Wow. I think as I was reading this book, I also felt it was a remarkably generous pedagogical tool that you were leaving or giving to us. There's a very teacherly, there's a kind of teaching epistemology baked into the book. If you had to say to graduate students, there are two things I want you to take away from reading this book, what would they be?
Read, read, read. Research, research. Argue against yourself and your assumptions. Take the work of art seriously. Do not project. Ask the work for the ideas to emerge from the work. Yeah, that's a start.
That's a good start. It's a good start. Okay. It's a brave start as well. I mean, I think as I was reading the book, I kept saying, man, she's brave, she's small, but she tell her, right? Because there is a enoughness about what you're doing, right? Is that I feel in many ways, and I am not an art historian, I'm someone who writes with an interest to art. I feel like you're calling out art history and art historians.
Yeah.
And just saying, be better. And I feel like I want to stand up and applaud that, but I think it's brave in the age of just kind of, I want to write the book that adds to the field versus saying I want to write a book that changes the field. And I feel like that's very much what you have set out to do and done, I would say, in this book.
Thank you. Should we go to questions? I don't know.
And on that note.
Hello. So I really want to thank you, Erica, and I want to thank the questioners as well. This was pretty important. I first want to start off by saying you made sense for me of why I am doing my PhD. And in art history and looking at Caribbean art, because of a profound unhappiness with things that I thought was missing, things that people weren't looking at. So I want to thank you for that. And then I had a question, two questions really, very quickly. One is that you talk about meeting the work of Edouard and others outside of the Caribbean, not within the Caribbean, right? And I wanted to know why that was so. And then the second question I had is, I actually knew Kamau Brathwaite very well too. I was a student at NYU. He would call me at home. We would chat, and we'd carry on. But it didn't, until you spoke today, I didn't realize that. But of course, the ways in which he wrote and how he organized text on the page is profoundly visual, And then it made me think back to a tiny little book I did years and years ago called Writers Who Paint, Painters Who Write, 3 Jamaican Artists. And I was always fascinated by artists who were moving among genres, right? Whether some of us get criticized for this endlessly, but whether they're writers and then they're painters and then they're thinkers, and this happens a lot in the Caribbean. So I wanted to know why you think this happens so much in the Caribbean, right? Probably as you were talking about being able to express ideas differently through different medium. I was thinking that through. And why do we encounter so much of the work of the Caribbean outside of the Caribbean?
We encounter it because that's where it is. A lot of it is. It's not that it's not in the Caribbean, but it's also in the world. I don't like to pit it against here and there. I know I couldn't see Philip Moore's work unless I went to Guyana, but I just happened to be an undergrad in Paris trying to find Caribbean artists, and I came across Edward's work there. It's the way we move in the world, Jackie, and I think it's, rather than think about here and there, I think I want to think about that the spectrum of experience, right? So that a lot of women artists, for instance, had to leave the Caribbean if they wanted to be taken seriously or to even do their work. This generation isn't moving as much as previous generations. It's shifted. But that has to do with a complex of economics, history, colonialism, movement, what movement meant. And we have to follow the ebbs and flow of that historically and understand how people respond on an individual level. I'm fascinated by Valerie Brathwaite, for instance, who is a Trinidadian artist, which no one knows a lot about her work. But Valerie Brathwaite is of the generation of maybe a little younger than Mavis Pusey, Althea McNish. Althea McNish went to Britain. Pusey went to New York. Brathwaite went to Venezuela. They made choices. They knew they had to leave, but they made choices on where to go. And how we know them depended on the space in which they traveled to, right? And the kind of shine the art world was giving to those spaces. So there's that. And in the Bahamas, I grew up in the Bahamas. Janine grew up in the Bahamas. No one was taking us seriously as artists. If we wanted to do that thing, we had to go somewhere else to do that. Okay? And that's fine for me. That's life. We always move back and forth. In terms of the second half of your question about multiple genres, that's what the Geoffrey Holder Project is about. When Geoffrey Holder passed away in 2014, his family invited me, heard that I was interested in these kinds of things. And I went to New York to meet Carmen de Lavalade and Leo. And they said, everyone thinks of our dad as a dilettante. My dad is a dilettante, right? He did a little of this, he did a little of that. No one takes him seriously. What can you do to change the narrative? Can you change the narrative? And so our whole entire Geoffrey Holder Project is about looking at the ways in which Caribbean artists working in multiple modalities need to be studied and why they work in these modalities. Once again, what's the work of this, right? And it's been absolutely eye-opening. And in certain ways, people want you to be a writer. They want you to be an artist. They want you to be a doctor, but they can't imagine you being good at everything, right? And I increasingly, as we've done our Geoffrey Holder Project, I've realized he was just brilliant, right? There was just no one, there were others like him. But that brilliance, that ability I was watching this video of him just drawing the other day, making this sort of figure come alive. He was doing some designs for Firebird, for the Dance Theater of Harlem's, the costumes for Firebird. And you should see his smile as the figure sort of unfolds on the page and how he gets into it, right? But even as he's drawing, he is thinking about how that figure is going to move in that costume. He's thinking about other things. And what we're trying to do with the project is to really surface what does it mean to be a multimodal Caribbean artist? And how do you write about that artist? Understanding that for him, people don't know this, his painting undergirded was the basis of everything for him. It was the basis of everything. And he's important because he too, like Césaire, this is the boldness, the sort of bigotiness of that generation that I want to embody, is that in 1954, when he came to the United States, he was 6'6" and stunning, and everybody wanted a piece of him. And Carl Van Vechten wanted to photograph him. And Carl Van Vechten goes and photographs him in the sort of tropical style. And Geoffrey comes back the next day and he says, "This is how you're going to photograph me." And he brought his paintings with him. So Van Vechten had to take off those turbans and he had to photograph him with his paintings as an artist. That's changing the narrative. And it's my responsibility, I think, as an art historian, to sort of do that work on a field level, a discipline level, for artists from the Caribbean, the African Diaspora, and the Americas.
And I think, can I follow up on that? I mean, it's interesting. I literally just had this conversation with my grad students on Monday about the multiple genres of writing. So it's interesting. I would have said it was of the Césaire, Lamming generation, but I realize, I mean, we look at our friend and colleague Kai Miller, who is an essayist, is a poet, is a fiction writer. My line for that question is always that Caribbean artists have never had the luxury of working in one form and one form only. Do you agree with that? Or is that,
I don't know if it's a luxury. I mean, when I think of the generation of the Aubrey Williams and all of them, right? They started out as agronomists and they had jobs, right? They had to lawyer up or become lawyers or doctors or do something else because there wasn't any space to be an artist full time. They had to, in a sense, merge into that. But when you think about form itself, like the different processes, I think you have to follow the way you think. And I think, I don't know, something about being a person from the Caribbean or being in diaspora, means that you give yourself permission. One of the things Brathwaite taught me, and I write about it at the end, but also Césaire, is that we need to give ourselves permission to think and rethink, right? We're in this age where we have to publish immediately. Everybody, everybody wants you to publish tomorrow, your thoughts for today. But what I loved about them was that they gave themselves permission to write an essay, rethink that essay, republish it in a different form, right? They gave themselves room to sort of think and imagine. And you just don't see that in the academy anymore, right? In fact, we were like, oh, you just published this. But no, I did not. This is something, we don't even give ourselves that kind of leeway to have a different thought. We have to have everything cooked and curried right away, right? And in there. And Brathwaite talks about deterning, changing his mind, and Césaire changed his mind, right? He started out as a poet. We know him as a poet. Then he saw what Suzanne was up to and how she was moving the crowd, so to speak, with her theater work. And what does he do? He turns to writing plays, right? Because he wants the work to reach the people. And there's a consciousness there, right? That I know what this form can do. It's not quite doing what I want it to do. So I'm going to switch forms. I'm going to write, and I need to think in a different way too. And so he writes the tragedies of Christophe. He rewrites the Tempest. He does some other, he goes to the theater. He moves to the theater, and then he does other things. He's writing criticism. He's writing, So I don't know. I think there's been a freedom to do that, that a lot of intellectuals, Caribbean intellectuals, have taken, and maybe because maybe some of us started as agronomists. We know we have to,
No, I think it's interesting. As I'm hearing you say that, I'm now thinking that maybe that historical reimagining is part of the changing of genres. And so for Brathwaite, he might have republished that essay 6 times. For Miller, it started as a poem, and the cartographer tries to map his way to Zion, but then it becomes a continuation of that narrative in August Town. It's still the same project, but it's a further thinking of that project in a way that the form of the poem, giving me just as the next essay. It's just giving me a different way to think about it, right? Because Nobesi Phillips once said that, because she's another one of those, was a lawyer, decided, that law was helpful for the poetry she wanted to write, right? Because she said there's certain arguments you can make in essays that you can't make in poems, that the form of the poem was too limiting. And then she finally said, well, poetry is too, I need to change poetry. Speaking of bigness and enoughness, right? Yeah. What does it mean to say that the poem, the genre is not enough, that I need to make something new?
but to recognize the not enoughness means that you understand that your work is doing something, right? You understand the critique and the creative process. And so it goes back. And I think that is something that I kept seeing as I was reading, right? This consciousness that this work was powerful enough to whatever. And this attentiveness to wanting it to not be for here, but to be for here, you know? And I just try to follow it.
I think it's fascinating. And I think it's interesting that someone said, well, I can tell you're really pissed because the chapter, the Caribbean does not exist, that is scathing. It is scathing. And there's one sentence in particular, I'm still reading it. You say, the plantation economy never existed in the Bahamas until tourism. That is your analysis of the way British and Europeans promoted tourism is just chilling.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, specifically not the Caribbean, but the Bahamas. Bahamas doesn't have a plantation history, but it does have a tourism, a neo-plantation history, to the point where they would name hotels after after plantations. And we still, I'm trying to get students to think beyond tourism now, because I think we have a nice a body of critical work on tourism. But I think it's something that everyone needs to read about and know how those structures work, right? And they're very complicated. They're not simple in the region, and they differ.
I think in some ways they're still at work.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that's why Maurizio Cattelan could go into the Caribbean and perform the sixth whatever. The
Infuriating.
There you go. You see, Elisa, you are angry too. And that's what I wanted to do. I want people to be pissed about that, because we can't, you have to call artists when they do bullshit, you know? And I think, and you don't have to, other people may think it's great, but you have to know your position in relation to a work of art. Right? And it doesn't have to be the same as someone else. And people may not agree with me, because a lot of people think it was brilliant. At least they were trying to remake it as a brilliant thing. But no, it really exposed, I think, the art world. And it exposed the art world during a moment when this whole notion of the global was really blowing up, right? And what I want us to always remember, that when we talk about this sort of this push for the global, that we're not pushing the sort of American view of the world on the world. No. we need to really put that aside. But he's reflecting, and he's a very powerful artist today. That was the brave part, right? I'm like, Lord, if I write this, my career over, hey. But you have to say what you have to say, you know.
But with that chapter, I was thinking about a tradition in the Caribbean of mento and calypso, and being able to signify on people in a kind of a playful way. And that whole chapter on Catalan is like signifying on steroids, but done in a very elegant and fun way. I mean, you're bringing up the absurdity of that project, but you're doing it in a way that also provides some real useful narratives around all the things that are the economic engines, like tourism and the like.
Yeah. I was going to say it was politely scathing.
Thank you. Yeah. I would say buy the book.
Yes.
Duke University Press would be very happy.
Buy
and
the
their
book.
copies.
Buy the book. Thank you, Erica.